Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Adaora had seen the dog before, watching from a distance, its golden eyes never blinking. It never came close, never made a sound, but it was always there. On cold nights, when hunger gnawed at her stomach and her stepmother's voice echoed with cruel laughter, the dog sat beyond the compound, a silent witness. But tonight was different. Tonight it stood at the doorstep, hackles raised, its breath fogging the air. And tonight it was not alone. The wails of a newborn filled the small room, but the air was thick with something heavier than joy. The midwife wiped sweat from her forehead, her hands trembling as she cut the umbilical cord. Ifeoma lay still on the mat, her chest unmoving, her once bright eyes staring at the thatched ceiling above. The women in the room exchanged glances, their silence laced with something unspoken. Death had arrived where life was supposed to begin. Outside, Chijioke paced, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had been praying for his wife, for his child, for the family he had longed for since the day he placed his hands on Ifeoma's belly and felt the first flutter of life within. But when the door finally opened and he saw the expression on the midwife's face, the breath left his body. "She is gone," the woman whispered, barely audible over the baby's cries. A sharp, unforgiving pain tore through him, but before he could fall apart, a bundle was placed in his arms. Small, warm, fragile. His daughter. The last gift Ifeoma had left him. He looked down at her tiny face, so much like her mother's, and despite the unbearable grief crushing his chest, he made a silent vow. He would love this child, protect her, give her the life Ifeoma had wanted for her. No harm would ever come to his Adaora. For the first few years, Chijioke kept his promise. Adaora became his world, and he shielded her from anything that could break her innocence. He carried her on his back to the farm, let her nap in the crook of his arm, and told her stories under the moonlight. But grief is a patient predator, and loneliness is its sharpest claw. The elders whispered that a man could not raise a child alone, that Adaora needed a mother. Chijioke ignored them at first, unwilling to replace Ifeoma, but as time passed, the emptiness of his home became unbearable. Then came Nneka, a woman with a quiet smile and hands that knew how to soothe. She seemed kind, gentle, eager to care for Adaora as though she were her own. Chijioke, tired of fighting his loneliness, let himself believe that Nneka would be the missing piece in their home. In the beginning, it seemed to be true. Nneka braided Adaora's hair, cooked for her, sang to her. For a fleeting moment, Chijioke thought he had found peace. But peace does not last where shadows lurk. It started with a look, barely noticeable at first, the flicker of something cold in Nneka's eyes when Chijioke held Adaora too long, the tightness in her smile when Adaora mentioned her late mother. Then came the whispers. "She is too spoiled," Nneka would say, her voice low, sweet like overripe fruit. "She is stubborn, Chijioke. You let her have too much of your heart." Chijioke, weary from the demands of life, began to listen. He did not notice when Adaora's laughter grew quieter, when she stopped running into his arms with the same excitement. He did not question why her small shoulders hunched whenever Nneka passed by, or why her eyes darted toward the floor, as if afraid to be seen. But Nneka noticed, and she smiled. Because cruelty, when done slowly, is not seen as cruelty at all. It is just discipline, just correction, just a child learning her place. The first time Adaora felt the sting of Nneka's cruelty, it was so subtle that she did not understand it as cruelty at all. It was the small things at first, her stepmother's voice dropping just a little too low when she spoke to her, the way her fingers lingered on Adaora's arm a second too long when pulling her away from something she loved. The warmth in Nneka's touch that had once been comforting was now cold, unfamiliar. One evening, as Adaora sat on the floor, carefully threading beads into the worn string of an old bracelet, Nneka walked past and knocked it from her hands. "You are too old for such foolishness," she said, her voice carrying no anger, only impatience. Adaora looked up, confused, but Nneka did not spare her another glance. The beads scattered across the floor, rolling under chairs and into corners, and as Adaora scrambled to collect them, she felt the first tremor of something nameless settle in her chest. When she later told her father, Chijioke only sighed and patted her head. "She is only trying to teach you," he said. "You must learn to listen to her." And so, Adaora learned. She learned to move quickly when Nneka called, to keep quiet when she wanted to cry, to nod and lower her gaze when her stepmother scolded her. It was easier that way. But cruelty, when left unchecked, only grows bolder. As the months passed, Nneka's patience thinned, and the softness she once feigned disappeared entirely. Adaora began to notice that her portions of food were smaller than before. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Perhaps Nneka had simply miscounted while serving. But as the weeks stretched on, the mistake became a pattern. Her belly would grumble at night, and she would lie awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying to ignore the sharp ache of hunger. When she asked for more, Nneka's lips curled into something that almost looked like a smile. "You eat too much for a girl your size," she would say, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. Adaora learned to stop asking. The chores became heavier, too. At first, it was just sweeping the yard and washing the plates. But soon, she was fetching water from the farthest well, scrubbing the floors until her fingers ached, and cooking meals she was barely allowed to eat. Still, she tried to tell herself it was normal, that maybe all stepmothers were like this, that maybe she was the one who needed to do better. But at night, when she lay curled on her mat, she could still hear her father's voice from years ago, whispering a promise, "No harm will ever come to you, my Adaora." And she wondered if he had simply forgotten. One evening, as the sky burned orange with the setting sun, Adaora sat by the doorstep, her legs drawn to her chest, watching the villagers move about their evening routines. Her father was still at the farm, and Nneka was inside, humming softly as she prepared a meal that Adaora would only get the smallest share of. It was then that she noticed the dog. It stood at the far end of the compound, just beyond the fence, watching her. Its coat was dark, its eyes bright and unblinking. Something about the way it stared made her uneasy, yet she could not look away. It did not move, did not bark, did not twitch a muscle. It only watched. Adaora swallowed, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She had never seen this dog before, and yet something about it felt oddly familiar. She glanced back toward the house, half expecting Nneka to call her inside, but the door remained shut. When she turned back, the dog was gone, as if it had never been there. A shiver ran down her spine, but she did not know why. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth as Adaora lay on her thin mat, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the lantern in the corner of the room. The distant sounds of crickets filled the silence, but her mind was restless. Her stomach ached from yet another night of little food, and her arms burned from scrubbing the floors until her skin was raw. She turned on her side, hugging herself, willing sleep to come. But just as her eyes began to droop, a strange feeling crept over her, the same prickling sensation she had felt days before. Slowly, she sat up and turned toward the small window, her heart beating faster with each passing second. And there it was, the dog. It stood in the darkness, just beyond the compound, its golden eyes locked onto hers. Adaora's breath hitched. It was the same dog, the one that had watched her before. Its presence was unsettling, yet not frightening. It did not move, did not blink, did not bare its teeth. It only stared, as if waiting. She wanted to call out to it, to ask why it kept coming back, but the words stuck in her throat. After a long moment, she pulled her knees to her chest and turned away, squeezing her eyes shut. When she finally gathered the courage to look again, The dog was gone. Days passed, and the dog continued to appear, always at a distance, always watching. It never came closer, never made a sound, never followed her beyond the compound. At first, Adaora tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just a stray. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something unnatural about the way it appeared only when she was alone, how its gaze seemed to pierce through her, understanding things she could not put into words. Once, while fetching water from the well, she felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, and there it was again, standing at the edge of the path, waiting. She dropped her bucket, her pulse quickening. This time, she forced herself to move closer, just a few hesitant steps, her breath uneven. But the moment her foot touched the dry leaves near the bush, the dog was gone, disappearing as silently as it had come. Her chest tightened with something she could not explain. Was it fear, or was it something else? The presence of the dog did not go unnoticed by others. Nneka, who had always been quick to find something to scold her for, began to glance toward the compound's edge with narrowed eyes whenever Adaora paused to look. "Why do you keep staring into the bush like a fool?" Nneka snapped one evening as she yanked Adaora's arm, dragging her back toward the house. "What nonsense are you looking for?" Adaora wanted to say the truth, that there was something there, something that returned night after night. But she bit her tongue. She knew Nneka would never believe her, and worse, she feared what would happen if she did. That night, as she lay on her mat once more, she whispered a question into the empty room, her voice barely above a breath. But the only answer she received was the rustling of the trees outside, the distant hoot of an owl, and the golden glow of eyes that never stopped watching. The rain came without warning, sweeping across the village in heavy sheets, turning the dry earth into thick mud. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the thin wooden shutters of the house, making them groan as if the walls themselves were alive. Adaora sat curled in a corner of the small room she shared with the cooking pots and firewood, hugging her knees to her chest. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the ground beneath her. She had always been afraid of storms, but tonight something else sent shivers down her spine. Nneka had gone to bed early, her voice sharp with irritation after a long day. Chijioke had not returned from the farm before the rain began, and Adaora knew better than to ask about him. Instead, she remained in her place, waiting for the house to settle into silence. But then she heard it, a faint scratching sound against the door. Her breath caught in her throat. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then it grew firmer, more insistent. Adaora's fingers dug into her arms as she held herself tighter, her pulse a steady drum in her ears. Slowly, she turned her head toward the door. The fire from the dying lantern flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the walls, but through the gap at the bottom of the door, she saw it, two golden eyes glowing in the darkness. She did not scream. She wanted to, but the sound never left her lips. The dog had never come this close before. It had always lingered at the edges of the compound, watching from a distance, but now it was here, only a thin wooden barrier separating them. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low whimper, a sound so strange that it sent a cold shiver down her spine. Adaora swallowed hard, pressing her back against the wall. Was it trying to come inside? The thought unsettled her, yet she could not bring herself to look away. The rain poured heavier, drumming against the roof like 1,000 restless fingers. The dog did not move. It did not growl, did not bark, did not demand anything from her. It only stayed there, silent and waiting. Slowly, almost without thinking, Adaora reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the wooden latch. She did not know why she wanted to open the door, why something deep inside her ached to see it up close. But just as her hand touched the wood, a loud crash echoed through the house. Nneka's voice followed, sharp and filled with anger. "Adaora, what are you doing?" Adaora jerked away from the door, her heart leaping into her throat. The golden eyes vanished. The moment was gone. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth. Adaora stepped outside, her bare feet sinking into the damp ground. The compound was quiet, except for the distant chatter of neighbors shaking out their mats and gathering fallen branches. She turned toward the spot where the dog had been the night before, half expecting to see paw prints in the mud, proof that it had truly been there. But there was nothing. No marks, no sign that anything had disturbed the ground. She frowned, her chest tightening with unease. Had she imagined it? No, she was certain of what she had seen, what she had felt. She looked toward the trees, scanning the shadows, but the dog was nowhere in sight. Yet, even in its absence, she could not shake the feeling that it was still near, hidden just beyond where her eyes could reach, waiting for a moment only, it seemed to understand. The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the compound as Adaora swept the damp earth with slow, deliberate strokes. The bristles of the broom scraped against the ground, the only sound breaking the uneasy silence that had settled over her. Nneka had been restless since the storm, moving through the house with an air of agitation, her mood sharp like a blade against stone. Adaora had learned to stay out of her way, to make herself small, unnoticed. But even as she swept, her thoughts wandered back to the night before, the scratching at the door, the golden eyes watching her in the darkness. A shiver crawled up her spine despite the heat of the morning. The absence left a hollow feeling in her chest, a strange kind of uncertainty she could not shake. Had she imagined it? The question lingered, unwelcome and persistent, yet deep inside she knew the truth. The dog was real. She had seen it, felt it, and somehow she knew it was not just a stray wandering the village. It was something else. Something that belonged to her in a way she did not yet understand. The weight of it followed her throughout the day, pressing against her ribs like an unspoken secret. As she washed the wooden bowls by the water drum, her fingers moved mechanically, scrubbing without thought. The other children in the compound ran past, their laughter bright, carefree. Adaora did not look up. She had long stopped trying to be part of their world. Nneka's sharp voice had made sure of that. "You are not like them," she had said once, her tone edged with something Adaora did not have a name for. "You do not have their freedom." And so, she had learned to exist in the spaces between, to move silently through the day, doing what was expected, never more, never less. But today, something felt different. The sun was too hot, the air too thick, the silence too heavy. She could feel it like the moments before a storm when the sky holds its breath. As she lifted a bowl to rinse it, her gaze drifted toward the trees beyond the fence. For a moment she thought she saw a shadow move between the leaves, a flicker of dark fur, a glint of gold. Her pulse quickened. The dog. It was still here, watching, waiting. That night, as the household settled into sleep, Adaora remained awake, staring at the ceiling. The wind had returned, whispering through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of the earth, damp and alive. She listened, her ears straining for any sound beyond the rustling leaves, for the soft scratch of claws against wood. Her fingers curled into the thin fabric of her wrapper, her breath shallow. Would it return? Would it come to the door again, waiting as it had before? Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. But just as she began to think the night would pass without event, something changed. The air inside the room grew thick, pressing down on her like unseen hands. The lantern flickered, the flame twisting unnaturally. And then, from outside, a sound reached her ears, a low, not human, not of this world. Her body stiffened. The golden eyes had not yet appeared, but she knew, without doubt, that it was there, closer than before. The house was swallowed in darkness, its silence broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wooden beams shifting against the night wind. Adaora lay motionless on her mat, every muscle in her body wound tight, her breath shallow. The steady rise and fall of Nneka's breathing came from the other room, a reminder that she was not alone, yet it brought no comfort. Something was outside. She could feel it pressing against the thin walls, lurking just beyond the reach of sight. The air carried a faint, musky scent, one she recognized now. It was the dog. It had not left. It had been waiting. Slowly she turned her head toward the small opening in the wooden window, the only connection between her and the night. At first, there was nothing, only the deep blackness stretching beyond the compound. But then movement, a shape shifting within the shadows, its outline barely visible in the faint moonlight. And then the eyes, two golden orbs, gleaming like embers, locked onto her through the slats. Adaora's pulse thundered against her ribs, but she did not move. She could not. A strange sensation coiled in her chest, not fear, but something deeper, something that made her throat tighten and her skin prickle. The dog was not trying to frighten her. It was calling her. The moment stretched into eternity before the sound of footsteps shattered it, heavy, unsteady. Nneka. Adaora turned sharply, heart hammering as she listened. Her stepmother was moving through the house, her presence an unwelcome weight against the silence. A door creaked open. A pause, then a low muttering, as if Nneka were speaking to someone unseen. Adaora held her breath. She had learned long ago that Nneka's movements at night were unpredictable. Sometimes she would rise just to pace the house, other times to drink water, and then there were the nights when her intentions were far more sinister. Adaora had woken once to the sound of her name whispered in the dark, her stepmother standing by her sleeping mat, watching her with unreadable eyes. Tonight, something about her movements felt different, less restless, more determined. The sound of a latch lifting sent a sharp chill through Adaora's body. The back door. Was Nneka going outside? The thought sent a strange jolt through her. The dog was still there, watching, waiting. Did Nneka know? Was that why she was awake? The tension in Adaora's limbs turned unbearable. She needed to see. Carefully, she pushed herself up, moving slow and soundless across the room. She reached the window just as Nneka stepped onto the damp earth outside. For a long moment, neither woman nor beast moved. Nneka stood at the center of the compound, her wrapper clutched tightly around her, her gaze shifting toward the trees. The night pressed in around her, thick with a silence that swallowed even the wind. Adaora held her breath, watching as Nneka's head tilted slightly, as though sensing something unseen. And then the dog moved. It stepped forward from the shadows, its body sleek and dark against the faint light of the moon. Nneka stiffened. Even from inside, Adaora could see the tension ripple through her frame. The golden eyes met Nneka's, unwavering, unafraid. For the first time, Adaora saw something shift in her stepmother's face, something close to fear. The dog did not growl, did not lunge. It only stood there, silent and knowing. And in that moment, Adaora understood something that sent ice through her veins. This was not a stray, not an ordinary animal. This was something else, something that had come for a reason. And Nneka knew exactly what it was. Nneka did not move. Her feet were rooted to the damp earth, her breathing uneven, almost labored. The dog stood just a few paces away, its golden eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. The air between them was heavy, charged with something unseen yet undeniable. Adaora, still crouched by the window, watched with bated breath. The way Nneka's hands trembled against the fabric of her wrapper, the way her chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow bursts, it was the first time Adaora had ever seen her stepmother afraid. And it was not the fear of an ordinary animal. No, this was something deeper, something primal. Nneka's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she took a slow, cautious step backward. The dog did not move. It only watched, waiting. Its presence was not threatening, yet it held the kind of weight that could not be ignored. It was a force, an undeniable truth standing before her. And Nneka knew it in the way her fingers clenched, in the way her body remained rigid, as though she had been caught in a lie she had buried long ago. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then, without warning, Nneka turned sharply and hurried back inside, slamming the door behind her with a force that rattled the walls. Adaora flinched, but did not look away from the window. She expected the dog to disappear, to retreat back into the shadows, as it always had. But it remained where it stood, unmoving, its golden eye still fixed on the door that had just closed. Adaora's pulse pounded in her ears. This was different. Something had changed. The dog had never revealed itself so openly before, had never allowed itself to be seen this clearly. It was no longer just watching, it was making itself known. Slowly, Adaora shifted her gaze back to the door, listening to the hurried rustling of fabric, the unsteady footsteps pacing the wooden floor inside. Nneka was shaken. Adaora could hear it in the way she moved, in the way her breath came too fast, too uneven. And then came a sound Adaora had never heard before, her stepmother muttering under her breath, her voice sharp, panicked. Not scolding, not commanding, but pleading. With who? With what? The realization struck Adaora like a cold wind. Nneka was afraid of the dog, and not in the way one feared a wild animal, but in the way one feared something they had wronged. The weight of this truth settled deep in Adaora's chest, stirring something raw, something she had never dared to consider before. Why would Nneka be afraid? Unless she knew what the dog was, unless she recognized it. Adaora's fingers curled into the fabric of her wrapper, her breath coming unsteady now. She turned her gaze back outside, toward the silent figure standing in the moonlight. For the first time, she did not feel the urge to look away. Instead, she felt something else entirely, something unfamiliar, something almost comforting. The dog was not here to harm her. It never had been. It was here for another reason, and Adaora was beginning to understand why. The house felt different after that night. The air inside carried an unfamiliar tension, thick and unyielding, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Adaora moved through the day in a daze, her body performing its tasks, while her mind remained elsewhere. She stole glances at Nneka whenever she could, watching the way her stepmother's hands trembled slightly as she pounded yam, how she flinched at every unexpected sound. The usual sharpness in her voice had dulled, her presence no longer carrying the same authority. She was distracted and settled. And for the first time in Adaora's life, Nneka seemed smaller, no longer the immovable force that had loomed over her since childhood. Something had shifted between them, something unspoken yet undeniable, but Nneka refused to acknowledge it. She carried on as if nothing had happened, as if she had not stood frozen in the yard the night before, staring into the golden eyes of the creature that had rooted her in place. But Adaora saw through it. The fear was there, lingering just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. That night, the silence in the house was heavier than ever. Nneka went to bed earlier than usual, closing her door with an urgency that did not go unnoticed. Adaora lay awake on her mat, her ears straining for the familiar sounds of the night, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of crickets, but all she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She turned her gaze toward the window, half expecting to see the golden eyes waiting for her, but the dog was not there, and yet its presence clung to the air, unseen but deeply felt. A strange sense of knowing settled over her, a quiet certainty she did not yet have the words for. The dog had come for a reason. It had revealed itself not just to her, but to Nneka. It had not barked, had not attacked, had done nothing but stand there, watching, waiting. But for what? Adaora's thoughts twisted in endless loops, questions colliding against one another with no answers in sight. She pressed her fingers against her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart. The truth was close. She could feel it, hovering just beyond her reach. The next morning, Adaora rose before the sun. The air was cool, thick with the scent of wet earth. She stepped outside, her feet sinking slightly into the damp ground as she looked toward the trees. She did not know what she was expecting to see, but a part of her hoped that the golden eyes would be waiting for her, that the presence that had lingered for so long would finally take shape in the daylight. But there was nothing, only the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. She exhaled, turning back toward the house, only to stop mid-step. Nneka stood in the doorway, watching her, but it was not the usual look of disdain or impatience. It was something else, something that made Adaora's skin prickle. Nneka's eyes were shadowed, her face drawn tight as if she had not slept. But more than that, there was something in her expression Adaora had never seen before, a hesitation, a vulnerability, a crack in the mask she had always worn. For the first time, it felt as though the power had shifted. Adaora held her gaze, unblinking. And in that moment, she knew Nneka was afraid of something she could no longer control. And whatever it was coming. The night was restless, thick with the silence that felt unnatural, stretched too thin over something waiting to break. Adaora sat upright on her mat, her back pressed against the rough wooden wall. Sleep would not come. Not tonight. Not when she could feel it, the weight of something unseen pressing against the air, stirring the very walls of the house. Nneka had barely spoken a word all day. She had moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps hurried, her glances darting to the windows as though she expected something to come crawling through them. Adaora had watched her carefully, the way her fingers fumbled with the cooking utensils, the way she jumped at the smallest sound. Fear clung to her like a second skin, suffocating, inescapable. And now, as the last embers of the kitchen fire died down, the house sat in complete darkness. Adaora could hear Nneka's restless shifting behind the thin wooden door of her room. Her breathing was uneven, too quick. She was waiting, just as Adaora was. But while Nneka was waiting in fear, Adaora was waiting for something else, a reckoning. Then it began. The wind outside stilled, the very air seeming to hold its breath. A faint sound, so soft it could have been mistaken for a trick of the mind, drifted through the night. A low, steady breathing. Not human, not natural. Adaora's pulse quickened, her hands gripping the fabric of her wrapper. The sound grew closer, moving with a purpose, until it was just outside the door. A soft scratch, deliberate, measured, sent a sharp tremor through the stillness. Adaora turned toward Nneka's room. Silence, but she knew her stepmother was awake, frozen in fear on the other side of that door. Another scratch, then a long pause. The breathing deepened, and then the door latch lifted. Adaora's breath caught in her throat. The door swung open, slow and soundless, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. But Adaora knew better. Something was there, watching, waiting. A shape moved just beyond the reach of the dim moonlight, and then the golden eyes appeared, glowing, piercing, filled with something ancient and knowing. The dog had returned, but this time it was not here just to watch. It was here to finish what had begun long ago. A sharp gasp cut through the air. Nneka's door burst open, and she stumbled into the room, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. She saw the dog, and let out a strangled cry, stepping back as if the very sight of it burned her. The dog did not move, did not snarl or growl. It only stood there, its presence heavy, undeniable. And then, as if the final thread had been pulled, Nneka A shudder ran through her, her hands trembling as she clutched her chest. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "Not you." Adaora watched, unmoving, her breath shallow. The truth hovered between them, thick and suffocating. The dog took a step forward, and Nneka flinched, a strangled sob escaping her lips. She knew. And now, so did Adaora. This was This was not some wandering spirit. This was something far more terrifying, something that had been watching, waiting for this very moment. The air in the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in, and as the golden eyes bore into Nneka, Adaora understood the unspoken truth that had been buried for years. The mother she had lost, the woman whose death had been wrapped in silence and lies, she had returned, and she had come for the woman who had taken everything from her. A deep chill settled in the room, thick and suffocating. The dog took another step forward, its golden eyes unblinking, its presence suffocating in the small space. Nneka scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the wooden floor, as if she could dig herself away from the inevitable. The fear on her face was unlike anything Adaora had ever seen, not the anger she often carried, not the sharp cruelty she wielded like a weapon, but something raw, something helpless. "Stay away!" Nneka's voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. But the dog did not stop. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. Adaora remained still, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The weight of realization pressed into her bones. This was no ordinary night. This was not just a spirit wandering aimlessly. This was justice. Justice that had waited too long. The walls of the house seemed to bend inward, the darkness growing deeper, swallowing everything except the three of them. Then, in a movement so sudden it barely registered, the dog lunged. A piercing scream tore through the night. Nneka thrashed, her arms flailing as she tried to fight off the force that had descended upon her. But the dog was not biting, not clawing. It was something worse. It was inside her now, its form shifting, twisting, consuming. Her body jerked violently, as if an unseen hand gripped her from the inside, pulling, tearing. Her screams turned to gasps, her body convulsing on the floor. Adaora watched, frozen, her fingers gripping her wrapper, nails digging into the fabric. She wanted to look away, to shut her eyes, but she couldn't. Nneka's face contorted, her hands clawing at her own chest, as though something inside her was trying to rip free. The air crackled with something ancient, something that did not belong in the world of the living. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. Heavy. Final. Nneka's body lay still, her chest rising and falling in uneven, shallow breaths. The dog was gone, but Adaora knew it had not truly left. It had done what it came to do. The night stretched on, endless in its eerie quiet. Adaora did not move for what felt like hours, her gaze fixed on Nneka's limp form. The woman who had tormented her, who had stolen the life of her mother, now lay broken, her body trembling in the dim light. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open, something in them was missing. The sharpness, the cruelty, it was gone. Replaced by emptiness. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Only a ragged breath. A hollow shell of the woman she once was. Adaora rose slowly, her legs unsteady, her body heavy with everything she had just witnessed. She stepped past Nneka without a word, pushing open the door and stepping into the cool night air. The sky was vast above her, the stars indifferent to the horrors that had unfolded beneath them. And then, just beyond the trees, a shadow moved, a shape familiar yet distant. The golden eyes lingered for a moment longer, before fading into the darkness. The mother who had loved her, the mother who had returned, had done what she had come to do. And now, at last, she was at peace. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.